Hey there, sleepless rabble. Before Monster. Season 4 drops, and the whole internet starts pretending they just discovered her. Let's talk about the woman who turned Victorian virtue into true crime legend. Lizzie. Freaking Borden. She was quiet, polite, the kind of girl who'd offer you tea and possibly the axe. No serial killer, no stranger danger. Just a prim New England lady who allegedly deleted her parents before breakfast and somehow walked free. And that's the difference between Napmax and Netflix. They'll dramatize it, we'll dissect it. With facts, psychology, and a little midnight sarcasm. If that's your flavor, hit like, smash subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Because next time, we might drag a monster from your neighborhood out of the dark. Alright, ready? Let's step back to Fall River, where the wallpaper was floral, the tempers were festering, and one very proper lady rewrote the definition of family drama. Fall River, Massachusetts, 1892. A town tidy enough to hide almost anything. Lace curtains, manicured lawns, gossip disguised as neighborly concern. Everyone knew everyone, or thought they did. At 92, 2nd Street stood a house too respectable for its own good. Narrow, upright, unwelcoming. The kind of house that looked like it had secrets nailed into its beams. Inside lived the Bordens, a family whose smiles were stitched tighter than their purse strings. Andrew Borden, the father, was worth a fortune and lived as if poverty were a moral virtue. No electricity, no plumbing, no softness allowed. Abby Borden, his second wife, tried to keep things pleasant, but pleasant is a fragile thing when money and resentment share a roof. Upstairs, the two daughters, Emma, the quiet one, and Lizzie, clever, composed, and just a little too observant. The morning of August 4th began in ordinary silence. The maid, Bridget Sullivan, was sick of washing windows. Abby moved about the guest room, plumping pillows no one would sleep on. Andrew left for errands downtown. Lizzie lingered. By late morning, the heat had turned heavy. The air sat thick inside the house, every door closed, every window a cage for the sound. No one noticed when a rhythm began upstairs. Dull, even, obscene in its regularity. Not shouting, not struggle, just thud, thud, thud. When it stopped, Abby lay face down between the bed and the wall, her hair matted with the reason why. Downstairs, time waited. The front door jammed when Andrew returned home. He swore, the only sharp word anyone heard from him that day. Minutes later, he sank into the sofa, shoes off, eyelids closing. He never saw the figure behind him, the shadow carrying something heavy, purposeful. The first strike split silence itself. The next 19 made sure nothing inside that house would ever feel alive again. When Bridget re-entered the parlor, Lizzie was standing there, pale, dry-eyed. "Father's dead," she said. No tremor, no hysteria. Just fact. Police were summoned. Neighbors gathered, thrilled and horrified. Inside, the heat clung to every surface, and the metallic smell began to spread. Officers stepped through the doorway like men entering a church that had lost its faith. There was no forced entry, no robbery, no clue pointing anywhere outside. Only Lizzie, calm as porcelain, repeating small contradictions. She'd been in the barn, no, the loft. Perhaps she'd heard a noise. When they asked about the hatchets, she said they'd been used for kindling. One was found clean. Suspiciously clean. Another had its handle broken. Conveniently useless. And in the kitchen stove, something burned. A dress. Blue cotton. Still smouldering. Old paint, she explained. Because what else would one burn in the aftermath of murder? Fall River turned rabid. Reporters arrived from Boston and New York. Sketch artists lingered outside the house, waiting for a glimpse of the genteel murderess. Women in corsets whispered that she had been driven mad by repressed fury. Men in waistcoats said women simply couldn't do such things. Everyone agreed on one point. Something about Lizzie didn't fit. She didn't cry. She didn't faint. She simply existed. A blank space where grief should have been. By evening, officers led her away for questioning. The crowd parted, watching her pass with morbid fascination. She looked neither guilty nor afraid. Just inconvenienced. Upstairs, the guest room cooled. Blood dried into wallpaper. The house seemed to exhale, relieved that someone had finally noticed it. Outside, the whispers gathered momentum. They would feed on her name for decades. But that first night, they were only beginning to form the legend. And as lanterns flickered against the darkening street, Fall River asked the question it never stopped asking. What kind of woman does this? The answer, it seemed, was standing right in front of them. Perfectly still, perfectly polite, and about to become the most infamous suspect America had ever seen. At the Fall River police station, the air smelled of dust, ink, and disbelief. No one knew quite how to question a lady about two bodies hacked to ruin. There was no precedent in their polite little world for corsets and carnage to coexist in the same sentence. Lizzie sat upright, gloved hands folded, spine as straight as the courthouse flagpole. Her dark dress looked freshly pressed, her expression polished to the same sheen. When an officer offered her water, she declined with a soft, "No, thank you," as if he'd offered her the wrong kind of tea. The detective's ordinary men, faces shiny with August sweat, tried to read her. They asked where she'd been. "In the barn," she said. "Doing what?" "Looking for iron." "For what purpose?" "To fix a screen." The words landed with the dull sound of pebbles hitting a wall. Each answer neat, brief, scrubbed of emotion. They pressed harder, and she changed the order of things. First she was in the kitchen, then outside, then back inside again. The contradictions were obvious, but her calm never faltered. One officer later swore her eyes were clear as glass, but colder. Another said she reminded him of a Sunday school teacher correcting a misbehaving class. It was unsettling. The stillness, the composure. People expected trembling, fainting, tears. What they got instead was poise. Outside, the press was already circling. By evening, headlines were screaming across New England. "Wealthy spinster held in parricide." "Axe mystery baffles Fall River." The story travelled faster than the investigation ever could. Reporters began camping outside the jail, describing every move she made. The tilt of her hat, the way she adjusted her gloves, the fact she read the Boston Globe instead of the Herald. It became theatre. And Lizzie, unwilling or not, was the star. During the inquest, spectators filled every available space. She entered the courtroom with a Bible in her hand, wearing black silk and an expression that could have been carved from marble. When she finally spoke, her voice was clear, almost musical, but oddly detached. She didn't sound like a murderer. She didn't sound like anyone. Her answers twisted like ivy, elegant, evasive, looping back on themselves. At one point, she corrected the prosecutor's grammar. At another, she asked for a glass of milk. Behind her, the townsfolk whispered, "She's guilty. She's innocent. She's possessed." Even the local minister visited, praying with her, proclaiming his belief in her purity. Fall River wanted to believe him, because if Lizzie Borden could do something like that, what did that say about the rest of them? Forensic science, such as it was in 1892, offered nothing concrete. Blood tests were unreliable. Fingerprints, not yet standard. The axe could have been anyone's, and every scrap of evidence seemed to dissolve under the weight of propriety. It was easier to doubt the facts than to imagine a woman swinging a blade with that kind of purpose. When she was formally arrested, she only sighed. "Does this mean I must go to jail tonight?" Her tone was polite, almost weary, as if someone had just asked her to host an unwanted guest. They took her to Taunton Jail, a grim stone building designed for thieves and drunks, not Sunday school teachers. Yet even there she remained immaculate. She received visitors, wrote letters in perfect cursive, read her Bible. The guard said she never wept. Emma came once, pale and tight-lipped, promising to stand by her sister. The townspeople admired the loyalty, though whispers followed Emma home, rumours that she knew more than she admitted. In Fall River, curiosity had mutated into obsession. Souvenir hunters stole chips of paint from the Borden house. Photographers posed outside the crime scene, smiling. Morbid tourism before the term existed. Respectable matrons debated in parlours whether they would be capable of such an act, if sufficiently provoked. The unspoken answer, perhaps. By the time winter crept over Massachusetts, Lizzie had become both villain and victim, saint and sinner, depending on which paper you read. But one truth stood firm. She never blinked. Not once in public. Not when they showed her the photographs. Not when they asked about the blood. To the men charged with judging her, that composure was either innocence or something far more chilling. Because who holds eye contact that's steady after looking into the abyss? And as the trial loomed, the nation prepared to watch her do it all again. This time in front of 12 men who'd never seen a woman accused of murder, and certainly never seen one smile through it. Fall River waited, breath held, morality trembling. And the house on 2nd Street? It waited too. Its walls still stained, its mirrors still watching, ready to see whether calmness could once again conquer the truth. To understand what happened on that August morning, you have to step inside the house as it was before everything broke. Not the museum version with guided tours and nervous laughter, but the living, breathing house that existed in 1892. The one that smelled of boiled mutton, stale coal dust, and restraint. The Borden home was a monument to thrift. Andrew Jackson Borden could afford luxury, but believed comfort bred weakness. He owned banks, properties, and factories, yet refused to install indoor plumbing. When neighbours installed electricity, he called it wasteful vanity. The family used oil lamps, chamber pots, and a furnace that groaned like an old dog. Even the wallpaper was years out of fashion, chosen for cost, not charm. The rooms themselves were a study in awkwardness. No hallways. Every bedroom led into another. Privacy was a theory, not a right. To reach Emma's room, you had to pass through Lizzie's. To reach the guest chamber, you crossed Abby's. For a family already divided by resentment, the layout was psychological torture. The house forced intimacy where none existed. Meals were eaten in silence. Andrew rarely spoke unless it involved business. Abby managed the household as best she could, though the daughters addressed her only as Mrs. Borden, never mother, never even Abby. That kind of distance isn't created overnight. It's cultivated. Lizzie and Emma believed Abby had married for money. and resented their father's generosity toward her relatives. He'd recently given Abby's half-sister a house, while his own daughters slept under the same roof they'd known since childhood. For Lizzie, every act of charity toward Abby's kin felt like betrayal. In February 1892, just months before the murders, Lizzie stopped eating meals with her parents entirely. She lived in the same house but moved like a ghost through its corridors. Present, but separate. She rarely spoke to Abby, avoided her father except for practical matters, and poured her energy into church work and charity committees. Fall River Society adored her for it. No one realized that those charities might have been the only place where she could breathe. Downstairs, Andrew's routine never changed. Breakfast at 7, business calls until 11, a nap on the sofa before lunch. He was predictable, unshakable, except for the occasional temper when household order slipped. He locked doors religiously, double bolting even interior ones. Control was his creed. Abby filled the gaps with housekeeping rituals, cleaning rooms already spotless, rearranging furniture that didn't need rearranging. A woman desperate to impose peace on a place that had none. Bridget, the maid, joked that the house was cursed, though softly, under her breath. The sisters found small escapes. Emma visited friends across town. Lizzie travelled to New Bedford to stay with relatives. Each time she returned, she seemed sharper, more restless. In June, she discovered her father had killed the family's pigeons with an axe. The birds she'd raised in the barn for company. They attracted boys, he'd said. It was the kind of petty cruelty that leaves splinters under the skin. By midsummer, tension had thickened into something you could taste. Even Bridget felt it. She told a friend later that meals had become unbearable. No one spoke, no one smiled. The air felt wrong. And then came the food poisoning. A week before the murders, all 4 family members fell ill after dinner. Abby suspected spoiled milk. Lizzie whispered it might have been deliberate. For once, no one laughed. The idea of poison lingered, invisible but heavy. Still, the daily rituals continued. The locked doors, the cold dinners, the sound of the clock marking time in a house where no one trusted anyone else. What's remarkable isn't that the murders happened. It's that they didn't happen sooner. Because under that roof, civility was armor. Every good morning was a performance. Every silence, a weapon. And somewhere in that quiet theatre of repression, something began to snap. Fall River would later claim to be shocked. But behind closed doors, every house had its own small cruelties, its own locked feelings. The Bordens were simply the ones whose walls finally gave out. If you stood outside on a summer night back then, you could hear the faint hum of conversation through those narrow windows. Nothing remarkable, just the soft, ordinary sounds of family life. But sometimes, between the words, there was something else. The sound of restraint cracking one polite breath at a time. And it was in those moments, beneath the gaslight and the lace curtains, that the story really began to take shape. Not with the axe, but with the years of quiet leading up to it. Because monsters are rarely born in violence. They're raised in rooms where everyone pretends everything's fine. And that's exactly where we're going next. Before Lizzie Borden became a headline, she was the product of a world obsessed with appearances. Victorian America loved its women modest, its men stoic, and its children obedient. Fall River, with its churches and textile mills, lived by that creed. What you felt didn't matter, what you presented did. Lizzie Andrew Borden was born in 1860, into comfort without warmth. Her mother Sarah died when Lizzie was barely 2. The official story said uterine congestion. The unofficial one was heartbreak and exhaustion. Either way, death left a void no one dared name. Emma, 9 years older, stepped in as caretaker, a child raising another. Father, Andrew, buried himself in work. It's what Victorian men did best: earn, endure, and never explain. When Andrew remarried 3 years later, the daughters tolerated Abby Durfee-Gray as a duty, not as kin. Lizzie was polite, always polite. She called her Mrs. Borden, never mother. Manners were armour, and she learned to wield them like a shield. Education came through the local schools and church classes. Lizzie sang in the choir, taught Sunday school, donated to missionary circles. Outwardly, she was the perfect daughter. Inwardly, something else brewed. There are stories, small ones, that she had a temper, that she could be cold, cutting, decisive. She wasn't cruel, but she was never quite soft either. Victorian womanhood didn't leave room for independence. A woman's ambitions were supposed to end in marriage or martyrdom, and Lizzie chose neither. By 30, she was already considered a spinster, a word designed to sound like a warning. But she didn't care. She had her committees, her church, her carefully pressed clothes. She was respectable, and that was power of its own kind. Still, Fall River whispered. It always did. Why wasn't she married? Why was she so outspoken? Why did she travel without a chaperone, wear black in summer, and challenge shopkeepers on prices? Every deviation from the expected became a curiosity. Behind all that was a mind that didn't quite fit her era. Lizzie read widely, loved theatre, kept track of politics. She'd seen the new century coming, but she was stuck in a house that belonged to the old one. No freedom, no fortune of her own, no say in how the family's money was handled. Everything belonged to Andrew, even the rooms she lived in, even her silence. That pressure, historians say, built slowly. The repression of Victorian society was a masterclass in psychological compression. Decades of no, not proper, and be grateful. And women like Lizzie learned to smile through their teeth while something behind their ribs burned quietly. When friends visited, they described her as gracious, intelligent, occasionally withdrawn. Others said she had a fixed gaze, as if always studying, measuring, waiting. Some believed she'd been emotionally stunted by the early death of her mother. Others thought she'd inherited her father's severity. It's tempting to romanticize her, to imagine a brilliant mind trapped in a suffocating age. But the truth is probably simpler and sadder. She was ordinary enough to be invisible, yet intelligent enough to hate it. At church, she found purpose. At home, she found friction. Her father's devotion to frugality bordered on tyranny. He refused to buy meat from the better butchers, refused new dresses, refused social outings. Even the family's meals reflected his restraint. Cold mutton, reused soups, leftovers disguised as respectability. By her 20s, Lizzie began showing signs of depression. Letters suggest she'd grown tired of the same routines, the same walls, the same insistence on obedience. "We never have visitors," she once wrote. "It is all so dull here." To an outsider, her life looked perfect. To her, it was a cage built of manners and money. That's the paradox of the Victorian home. The safer it looked, the more dangerous it became. Repression breeds pressure, and pressure demands release. Whether it comes out as tears, madness, or blood depends entirely on how tightly you've been holding the facade. By 1892, Lizzie was holding it tighter than ever. The church loved her. The town admired her, and the house she lived in had begun to feel like a closed fist. If you look closely then, really closely, you could see small fractures in her control. Moments of sarcasm too sharp to be polite. Glances that lasted a second too long. Words bitten off before they turned into something else. The signs were there. They always are. But in Victorian society, people preferred not to see them. They called it nerves. They prescribed walks, rest, prayer, anything but honesty. So Lizzie kept smiling, kept serving tea, kept walking to church with her gloves perfectly matched. And beneath that precision, something kept building. Because when you raise a woman to be silent, she learns to speak in other languages. In tone, in gesture, or if she must, in violence. And in Fall River, that silence had been echoing for 30 years. By the time 1892 rolled around, the Borden household was less a family and more a polite war zone. From the street, it looked immaculate. Clean lace, pressed curtains, freshly swept stoop. Inside, though, the air felt charged, like the pause before a thunderstorm. The sisters had stopped eating meals with their parents. What began as sulking had hardened into ritual. Lizzie and Emma took breakfast alone, often upstairs, their plates delivered by the maid in uncomfortable silence. The house itself was divided into invisible borders. Upstairs belonged to the daughters, downstairs to the parents, the maid shuttling between like a reluctant diplomat. To outsiders, this was a family disagreement. Inside, it was something uglier. It had started, at least officially, with real estate. Andrew, ever practical, had recently gifted Abby's half-sister a house. Not a grand one, but enough to spark resentment. His own daughters had begged for a property of their own for years. When they found out about Abby's gift, their anger simmered quietly. The kind that never cools. Andrew later gave them a small rental in return, but the damage was done. Lizzie's resentment of her stepmother hardened into something nearly ceremonial. She refused to address her as anything but Mrs. Borden. She stopped sharing family duties. She even skipped the traditional Sunday dinner, claiming headaches or errands. It wasn't rebellion, it was erasure. Emma, older and gentler, tried to keep the peace, but she followed Lizzie's lead. Together they formed their own small alliance upstairs. A kingdom of two, plotting in whispers. Abby knew she wasn't welcome, but she tried anyway, clinging to civility like a shield. When she entered the daughters' rooms, the conversation died instantly. The house, already claustrophobic, became unbearable. Its layout, door after door, each opening into another room, gave everyone the sense of being watched. There were no corridors, no privacy, just overlapping spaces where every movement echoed. Lizzie had complained to a friend. There's no way to live comfortably here. She wasn't wrong. The summer heat didn't help. The air thickened, trapping every unsaid word. Meals went uneaten, tempers shortened, and sleep came fitful and late. The neighbours might have noticed if they'd been looking, but no one ever looks too closely at other people's respectability. In June, a small argument over a dress exploded into a full shouting match. Abby accused Lizzie of ingratitude. Lizzie accused Abby of greed. Andrew ended it the only way he knew, by retreating to his office, pretending none of it existed. His solution to conflict was always distance, and distance in that house only made things worse. Then came the pigeons. Lizzie had kept them in the barn, a tiny sanctuary of her own. She fed them daily, watched them preen, named a few, but one morning, she found them gone, their necks twisted, their feathers scattered. Her father had killed them. He said boys had been breaking into the barn, and the birds invited trouble. That single act of thoughtless cruelty stuck like glass under her skin. She barely spoke to him after that. By July, even the servants were uneasy. Bridget, the maid, complained of headaches, of spoiled meat, of strange smells from the well. The family grew ill one week, vomiting, chills, weakness. Abby muttered about bad mutton. Lizzie muttered about poison. For days, everyone eyed their food as if it might bite back. And through it all, Lizzie's composure held. She smiled, spoke softly, went about her errands. Yet people around town began to notice a hardness in her tone, a distance that hadn't been there before. When she attended church, she seemed elsewhere, her expression fixed somewhere far beyond the hymns. Even Emma sensed something building. In a letter to a friend, she wrote that Lizzie had become queer and restless. Within weeks, Emma would leave town to visit friends. Exhausted, she said, by the air at home. It was the last time she saw their parents alive. Left alone with Andrew, Abby, and Bridget, Lizzie occupied a world of silence and heat. Breakfasts were perfunctory. Andrew locked every door. Abby clung to routine, desperate to keep the household upright. The tension had reached that brittle, dangerous stillness that comes just before a storm breaks, when everyone knows something's coming, but no one knows what form it will take. Looking back, the warning signs seem obvious, but the truth is, most tragedies look ordinary until the final second. A missing word, a slammed door, a gesture you've seen 1,000 times. Only this time, it's the last. By the first days of August, Fall River was in a heat wave. The air inside 92 2nd Street hung motionless, the kind of heavy quiet that presses on your skull. Even the clock seemed to tick slower. And then, one morning, something inside that house snapped. It wasn't rage, it wasn't madness, it was the simple, brutal logic of years of suffocation finally asking for air. What happened next turned the house into legend, but the fuse was lit long before the blade ever fell. And the day it did, the silence finally spoke. August 4th, 1892. The kind of morning that pretends to be ordinary. The sun rose lazy over Fall River, draping its light over the mills and rooftops, gilding even the dull bricks of 2nd Street. Inside the Borden house, it found dust in the curtains, polish on the furniture, and a family running on fumes. Bridget the maid had already been up for hours, fighting the windows that refused to stay open. Abby was moving through her endless checklist. Bed linens, guest room, breakfast. Andrew had left earlier to run errands downtown. The man carried order like armor. No one ever saw him without his pocket watch and his sense of control. Lizzie was there too, moving quietly through the rooms, polite as always. Her presence as smooth as the surface of still water. If you look closely, though, you might have seen something different in her that morning. A kind of calm, too heavy to be peace. The house was stifling. Outside, horses shifted restlessly in the street. Inside, time crawled. Breakfast had been cold mutton again, reheated and unappetizing, the smell clinging to every corner. Bridget gagged as she washed the dishes, muttering about how the family had all been sick the day before. Abby, ever practical, called it spoiled milk. But Bridget suspected something worse. Around 9, Abby went upstairs to tidy the guest room. It was her habit to keep everything immaculate, even when no one was expected. She moved methodically. Pillowcases, dusting cloth, small sighs between gestures. Downstairs, Lizzie told Bridget that her stepmother had gone to make the bed. It was the last time anyone saw Abby alive. Andrew returned home shortly after 10. The heat had thickened. His shoes stuck to the pavement as he walked. Bridget unlocked the door for him. The lock had jammed again, the key refusing to turn. He grumbled under his breath, annoyed but mild. "I think I'll lie down," he said, removing his shoes in the parlour. He settled on the sofa, newspaper half folded, eyelids lowering. The room was quiet except for the faint creak of the rocking chair and the hum of flies at the window. Lizzie stood nearby for a moment, as if deciding whether to speak. Then she turned and walked away. No one knows what happened next. No shouts, no struggle, only the sound of metal meeting flesh, a rhythm so deliberate it could have been mistaken for work. 17 blows, maybe more. When it was over, the parlour smelled of iron and oil. The carpet darkened, the clock ticked, and the quiet returned. Minutes later, Lizzie called to Bridget, her voice oddly steady. "Maggie, come quick." "Father's dead. Someone came in and killed him." Bridget froze at the bottom of the stairs. "Where's Mrs. Borden?" she asked. Lizzie's answer was precise. "I think she's out. She had a note from a sick friend. No one ever found that note." When the neighbours rushed in, Lizzie stood in the kitchen, calm, hands clean. She offered small details, her sentences clipped and deliberate. The police were sent for. They arrived to find her sitting upright, fanning herself, the perfect image of a Victorian lady suffering an unpleasant inconvenience. The investigation began in confusion. The doctor, summoned in haste, examined Andrew's remains and declared him gone, as if that needed confirming. Upstairs, a search revealed Abby, cold and stiff, in the guest room. She'd been dead for over an hour. The realization sank in. Both murders had occurred within the same house, in daylight. While only 3 people were present, Lizzie, Bridget, and the dead. They questioned the maid first. Bridget swore she'd been outside, vomiting by the fence, sick from spoiled food. She hadn't heard a thing. Then Lizzie. She told them she'd been in the barn, looking for iron to fix a screen. Her story wavered. First she'd eaten pears there, then she hadn't. First she'd been gone 20 minutes, then only a few. The details danced just out of reach, never quite consistent, never quite wrong. By noon, the house was crawling with police, reporters, and neighbours pretending to help. Word spread fast. 2 Bordens, murdered. No suspect, no robbery, no explanation. Lizzie's composure unsettled everyone. She answered questions with perfect courtesy, occasionally correcting an officer's phrasing. She asked if someone could fetch her a clean handkerchief. She offered the visitors cookies. Cookies. When asked whether her mother had enemies, she said calmly, "She's not my mother." Small sentence. Sharp edge. The doctor suggested she rest. The officers whispered among themselves. She wasn't behaving right. Not as they expected a grieving daughter to behave. But what did right look like in a town where women fainted at gossip and bled behind curtains in silence? By afternoon, the bodies were removed. The house exhaled again, heavy and sour. Someone found the handleless hatchet in the cellar. Small, sharp, almost clean, as though someone had washed it. No one said the words out loud yet, but everyone in Fall River thought them. The next morning, the whispers became headlines. Miss Lizzie Borden, detained for questioning. Daughter of respected businessman, denies involvement in grisly act. No intruder found. And just like that, a private tragedy became a national obsession. Because everyone wanted to know the same thing. If Lizzie didn't do it, who did? And if she did, how could she look so calm, By the summer of 1893, Fall River had stopped whispering and started shouting. The polite veil of doubt had burned away, and America was obsessed. The Boston Globe called it the most shocking domestic crime of the age. The New York Times sent reporters daily. Sketch artists filled their pads with her face. The calm eyes, the clean lines of a woman who looked more like a governess than a murderer. Lizzie Borden had become theatre, and everyone wanted a front row seat. The trial opened in New Bedford, not far from Fall River, in a courthouse packed with journalists, gawkers, and moralists who claimed to be above gawking. Tickets were traded, bribes exchanged. Even the jury seemed slightly starstruck. 12 men, all middle-aged, all white, all from a world where women were fragile things, vessels of virtue, incapable of violence. Lizzie entered each morning dressed in black silk, gloved and immaculate. She never wore mourning veils. Her eyes were too useful uncovered. Reporters described her as composed to a degree that borders on the uncanny. When she smiled, which was rare, the room froze. The prosecution had evidence, or what passed for it in 1893. The hatchet found in the basement, its handle mysteriously missing. The burned dress discovered in the stove, the inconsistent statements, the timing that didn't add up. But what they didn't have was blood. No witnesses, no motive anyone dared to name aloud. The state's attorney argued that greed was behind it. Lizzie wanted control of her father's fortune, tired of living under his thrift. It was a plausible story, but not a glamorous one. People wanted passion, insanity, something cinematic. What they got was arithmetic, money, resentment, proximity. Her defense team, led by George Robinson, the former governor of Massachusetts, was masterful. They painted her as a victim of cruel suspicion, a Christian woman trapped in a nightmare of circumstantial gossip. They exploited the jury's gallantry at every turn. Would a woman of her refinement commit such an atrocity? They asked. Heads shook. No, surely not. When Lizzie fainted during the testimony describing her father's wounds, the courtroom gasped. It was perfect theatre, the delicate lady overcome by horror. One journalist noted, her fall was timed with the precision of an actress. The press split in two camps, those who believed in her innocence and those who adored her guilt. Either way, they couldn't look away. Newspapers ran daily updates like serialized fiction. Merchants sold souvenir hatchet pins. Children chanted her name in playground rhymes. America had found its first modern media criminal, a woman who defied every role society had assigned her. The testimony dragged on for 2 weeks. Experts debated whether the hatchet could have caused such wounds. Neighbors claimed they'd seen nothing, heard nothing. Bridget, the maid, was pale and exhausted, repeating her story until even she began to doubt it. Emma stood by her sister, stoic, loyal, silent. The turning point came when the prosecution presented the burned dress. Lizzie admitted to destroying it, claiming it was ruined by paint. Without modern forensics, there was no proof otherwise. The evidence collapsed under the weight of politeness. The judge's instructions to the jury were, to put it mildly, gentle. He reminded them that suspicion was not proof, and that the defendant was a lady of good reputation. It was the 19th century's version of reasonable doubt. And it worked perfectly. After just 90 minutes of deliberation, the verdict came back. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted. Some clapped. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Lizzie didn't cry. She didn't even smile. She simply exhaled, a slow, measured breath. and whispered to her lawyer, "I am innocent. I leave it to God." Outside, crowds cheered, bands played. Inside, the press began crafting the legend. For the first time in American history, a woman had been tried for the brutal murder of her parents and walked free. It wasn't justice, exactly, but it was history. Lizzie Borden left the courthouse that day, not as a victim or a killer, but as something new. A symbol. A riddle wrapped in propriety. Too polite to confess, too composed to condemn. But Fall River didn't forgive her. Freedom didn't bring peace. She returned home to a town that crossed the street when she approached, that whispered murderous under its breath. The house on 2nd Street stood empty. She never set foot in it again. Instead, she bought a mansion on the hill, the wealthy part of town, and named it Maplecroft. If the verdict had set her free, the silence that followed trapped her all over again. And as the newspapers moved on to new scandals, the house she left behind remained exactly as it had been. Prim, airless, waiting. Because some walls remember too much to ever rest. Acquittal, it turns out, is not the same thing as absolution. Lizzie Borden left the courthouse free, but freedom in Fall River was conditional, granted by law, revoked by whispers. In the summer of 1893, she and Emma moved out of the house on 2nd Street. Too many memories, too many people staring through the windows. They bought a grander home on the hill, the respectable side of town where the industrial elite lived in peace above the smoke and gossip below. The house was christened Maplecroft. Elegant name, elegant facade, and walls just as silent as the ones she'd left behind. For a while, it seemed she might rebuild her life. She decorated lavishly, velvet drapes, carved furniture, silver in every drawer. She threw parties, small at first, then bolder. There was laughter, even music. Some said she smiled again. Others said she was trying too hard. But Fall River never forgot. At church, people turned away. Invitations stopped arriving. Even her name was dropped from the charity rolls. Murderers don't belong in the choir, someone whispered once. Lizzie didn't argue. She simply stopped attending. Emma stayed, loyal but tense. The sisters lived like exiles in their own town, bound together by the one thing they never discussed. For a decade they coexisted, silent partners in an unspoken secret. Then, around 1905, something fractured. Emma packed her things and left in the night. She never came back. No one knows exactly why. Some said they'd argued over money. Others said Emma couldn't bear the people Lizzie was inviting into the house. Actors, bohemians, the kind of lively company polite society disapproved of. Perhaps Emma just wanted peace, or distance from the shadow that never stopped following her sister. After that, Maplecroft belonged entirely to Lizzie. She travelled occasionally, Boston, New York, even Europe. She attended theatre performances, something she'd always loved but rarely allowed herself before. The papers noted her appearances with a mix of curiosity and judgment. Miss Borden of Fall River, seen at the Boston Opera House last evening. The tone said the rest. There were stories, of course. There are always stories. That she drank more than she used to. That she entertained younger friends with questionable reputations. That she lived richly on the fortune of the dead. The truth? Probably duller, lonelier, and sadder than anyone wanted it to be. Maplecroft was large, but Lizzie filled only a few rooms. She kept the rest immaculate, waiting, as if the right guest might finally arrive. She had servants who came and went, most staying only a year or two. Some claimed the house made them uneasy. Strange sounds at night, footsteps in halls, mirrors that seemed to reflect more than they should. Others said it was just the wind off the river. In 1927, after 3 decades of exile, Lizzie Borden died in her bed at Maplecroft. 66 years old. Cause of death? Pneumonia. No axe, no blood. Just the long fade of a woman who'd outlived her own myth. Her funeral was small. No relatives, only a few distant friends. Emma, still alive but estranged, sent no flowers. The sisters were buried side by side anyway, back in the family plot, because Fall River, with all its judgments, still believed in appearances. And yet, the story didn't end there. It never does. After her death, the town softened a little. Time blurs outrage into curiosity. The Borden house on 2nd Street was sold, then sold again, until someone finally decided to profit from its reputation. Today, it's a bed and breakfast, the kind that sells fear by the night. Guests take photos beside the sofa where Andrew Borden died, joke about hearing footsteps upstairs, and sleep badly under floral quilts. The irony is perfect. The woman who was never welcome in Fall River now draws its visitors. Maplecroft still stands too, stately and proud, the name carved into its stone steps. The paint has faded, but the house remains quiet, private, much like the woman who built it. There's a particular cruelty in how history treats women like Lizzie. It demands confession, but rewards mystery. It forgives men for violence, but never forgives women for composure. And Lizzie Borden's greatest crime, perhaps, was her calm. No one could ever prove what she did. No one could ever believe she didn't. She became both sinner and saint of restraint, a woman who refused to perform remorse for the comfort of others. And that, more than the axe, made her unforgettable. Because silence, when maintained long enough, becomes its own kind of echo. And in Fall River, that echo still hasn't stopped. For over a century, experts have tried to peer through the glass of Lizzie Borden's composure and find the crack. Everyone wants to know why. Why her? Why then? Why so calm? The Victorians had no language for trauma, no concept of suppressed rage, no patience for psychology unless it fit neatly in a sermon. But modern minds, with all our theories and acronyms, still can't quite solve her. Start with the obvious. Her upbringing. A childhood without a mother, a father whose affection came in ledgers and locked doors, a stepmother tolerated but never loved. That's not nurture. That's confinement. Every emotion, every disappointment, every flash of anger would have been swallowed, digested and hidden beneath layers of politeness. A society that demanded obedience from women was, in essence, breeding quiet pressure cookers. Lizzie was bright, sensitive, and socially aware. She knew what was expected of her and played the part to perfection. Sunday school teacher, church volunteer, model citizen. But repression doesn't erase emotion. It compresses it until it either implodes inward or explodes outward. Modern analysts have proposed everything from dissociative episodes to hysteria, from temporal lobe epilepsy to psychological snapping point. Some say she may have suffered a moment of fugue, a temporary disconnection from self, a blackout under stress. Others point to the possibility of long-term resentment curdling into something colder, premeditation disguised as madness. Then there's the cultural theory. The idea that Lizzie, whether guilty or not, became a scapegoat for a society terrified of its own shifting order. The 1890s were an anxious decade. Women were beginning to ask questions, stepping out of parlours and into politics. The new woman, they called her, independent, educated, unsettling. Lizzie's trial wasn't just about a murder. It was about that new possibility. If she was guilty, she represented female danger. If she was innocent, she represented female rebellion. Either way, she scared people. And fear, as history proves, sells better than truth. There's also the detail almost everyone forgets. The way she looked when accused. No hysteria, no breakdown, no trembling hands. Her stillness was her weapon, or her mask. The human mind struggles with contradictions. A calm woman and a brutal crime cannot occupy the same space without forcing the observer to choose which one to believe. And most people chose the calm. Some psychiatrists who studied her case years later described flattened effect. Modern readers might call it emotional blunting. A psychological armor built after years of suppression. Not evil, just empty. It's the same tone that echoes in her statements. I think she's out. I was in the barn. I didn't hear anything. Short, neutral, detached. The kind of language that doesn't just hide emotion, it erases it. Then again, perhaps she wasn't detached at all. Perhaps she was strategic. A woman accused of butchering her parents in 1892 had no playbook. Tears could be read as guilt, confidence as arrogance. Silence, however, was unassailable. You can't misquote what isn't said. Historians like to romanticize her, turn her into symbol, the repressed daughter who broke free with an axe, the feminist avenger before feminism had a name. But reality is rarely that poetic. Maybe she didn't crave freedom. Maybe she just wanted peace and, in a single unthinkable moment, made sure she'd have it. Or maybe she was innocent, the perfect victim of circumstance and social bias, a lonely woman in the wrong house, at the wrong time, with the wrong face for grief. The human brain hates ambiguity, but Lizzie Borden thrived on it. That's why she's endured. Serial killers are explainable, predictable even. But Lizzie? She's a blank page with blood on it. You can write anything there and make it fit. For psychologists, she's the eternal case study. For feminists, she's a tragic metaphor. For Fall River, she's still bad luck. And for everyone else, she's proof that sometimes the monsters we create aren't born in darkness. They're crafted in daylight, dressed in linen, and raised to smile through the storm. Because the real horror of Lizzie Borden isn't what she might have done. It's how easily we recognize the world that made her. A century and more has passed, but Lizzie Borden never really left Fall River. She lingers in nursery rhymes, in ghost tours, in Halloween masks, in every nervous laugh that follows the word axe. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. A rhyme written by strangers, repeated by children who never knew her name before they sang it. No jury, no evidence, no hesitation, just 4 lines that rewrote her entire existence. History compressed into rhythm, guilt packaged as entertainment. It's oddly fitting. Lizzie Borden didn't die a murderer. She became a brand. Fall River, once horrified, now profits from her. The Borden house is a bed and breakfast. Guests take selfies beside the blood-stained sofa, sip tea in the murder room, buy souvenir hatchets in the gift shop. Axe sighting, says the website. Somewhere, a Victorian ghost rolls her eyes. Even Maplecroft has become a kind of shrine. Paranormal shows film there. Mediums claim to feel her energy. Cold, intelligent, unimpressed. The walls hum with residual tension, or maybe just bad plumbing. It hardly matters. People don't come for truth. They come for the thrill of standing close to a question no one can answer. Hollywood found her irresistible too. Films, musicals, documentaries, reimaginings. Christina Ricci with eyeliner and fury. Lifetime movies with lace and melodrama. Each retelling polishes the myth a little more. The prim woman turned predator, the angel with the axe. Everyone wants to decide who she was, and no one can. And now, decades later, she's returning again. Monster. Season 4 will tell her story for a new generation, streaming her sins in 4K. It won't matter whether they get it right. They never do. Because Lizzie doesn't belong to truth anymore. She belongs to folklore. Every generation makes her over in its own image. To the Victorians, she was scandal. To the feminists, defiance. To modern audiences, she's content. The woman who turned blood into myth and silence into marketing. What's strange is how ordinary her story actually was. A cramped house, a bitter family, a woman running out of air. It's not the grand gothic horror people imagine. It's domestic pressure finally exploding under lace. That's why she lasts. Because under all the legend, there's something horribly familiar. Ask yourself, if you were raised never to shout, never to want, never to feel without permission, what shape would your rage take? That's the question Lizzie Borden leaves behind. Not whether she did it, but what it means that so many secretly believe she could. Fall River today is quieter. The mills are mostly gone, the river runs slower, the gossip now monetized through ghost tours. But when the night is still enough, and the houses settle with that old New England sigh, people swear they hear footsteps pacing inside number 92. Slow, even, deliberate. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's just memory doing what memory does best. Replaying the moments we'll never quite understand. Because some stories refuse to end neatly. They blur. They echo. They crawl back through time wearing new faces. And Lizzie's face, pale, composed, unreadable, is still there, watching us watch her. Half victim, half villain, eternally balanced on the edge of disbelief. She lived her whole life under the gaze of others. Now she's their reflection, the polite monster of American myth. So next time someone hums that childish rhyme, pause for a second. Behind its rhythm is a woman history never managed to bury. And if you listen closely, beyond the rhyme, beyond the chatter, beyond the streaming dramatizations, you might still hear her voice somewhere in the dark, dry and amused, whispering 41? Really? You'd think they'd at least count properly? And that was Lizzie Borden, the woman who walked free but never escaped. She became a rhyme, a rumor, a ghost in a pretty dress. And somewhere between history and horror, she found immortality. Maybe she was guilty. Maybe she wasn't. But she made the whole world wonder what a smile can hide. So, sleepless rabble. If you've been quietly judging her for the past hour, you might want to check your own walls for cracks. Pressure builds everywhere. Some of us just hide it better. If you like tonight's descent, hit subscribe to keep falling down these rabbit holes with us, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? We might dig into a predator, a myth, or a secret from your corner of the map next. Until then, sleep lightly, dream strangely. And remember, legends don't die. They just wait for someone else to retell them. This is Napmax Sleep Stories, and you've been listening to Boring Murder for Sleep, the house that kept bleeding. Good night, and good luck keeping the lights off.